A lone hunter stumbles upon a dying pregnant bear, and the revelation that follows will challenge everything he knows. What if the second chance at life wasn't found through human relationships, but through the primal, untouched wilderness? In the midst of a cruel winter, one man's solitary life is shattered by a fateful encounter that will change his future forever. A weak, expectant grizzly bear struggling to survive. What follows is a tale of trust, sacrifice, and an unspoken connection so deep that it forces him to question everything about life and himself. How far will he go to protect her, and what truths will he uncover along the way? Join us on this unforgettable journey. As the first light of dawn bathed the towering Rockies in a soft glow, Ethan Grant stood on the porch of his cabin, his breath rising in the cold air. At 55, the wilderness had carved its marks on him: weathered skin, a gray-streaked beard, and hands rough from years of surviving alone in nature. His cabin, a sturdy shelter nestled high in the mountains, groaned under the weight of fresh snow. Ethan had retreated here to escape the chaos of the world, to seek solace in the solitude of nature, where the wind and trees had become his closest companions. Yet this winter felt different. The cold seemed unrelenting, and even the creatures of the forest appeared desperate, their tracks deep in the snow as they searched for sustenance. Ethan moved through his daily routine, going through the motions of survival. The icy air stung his skin as he ventured out, rifle slung across his back, not for hunting, but for tracking. Observing animals had become his way of staying connected to the land, a silent communication with the wilderness that had become his only constant. As he walked through the forest, the silence was broken only by the crunch of his boots in the snow. The towering pines, weighed down by frost, stood motionless, offering no sound except the occasional groan of the wood. Following the trail of a deer, Ethan neared a familiar clearing. But today, something unexpected greeted him. He froze as his sharp eyes caught a flicker of movement. A massive grizzly bear, lying motionless in the snow, her breaths weak and labored. His pulse quickened. Instinct urged him to retreat, but something kept him rooted in place. Her amber eyes, both fierce and fragile, met his with a silent plea. Ethan tightened his grip on his rifle, knowing she posed no threat in her current condition. He crouched low to observe her. Exhaustion, hunger, and stillness marked her powerful frame, but most striking of all was the swelling of her belly. She was pregnant. The realization hit Ethan with the force of a cold wind. The rules of nature were unforgiving. The weak didn't survive, only the strong made it through. To interfere would be foolish, even dangerous. Yet her eyes, those amber eyes, held him there, unwilling to leave. "You won't make it like this," he murmured, his voice hoarse from disuse. The bear's ears twitched, and her gaze never left him. Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out some dried venison. A voice inside urged him to walk away, to let nature take its course. But instead, he extended the meat to her. "Easy now," he whispered. Her nostrils flared as the scent of the venison reached her, and she raised her head slightly. Ethan's pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed to be cautious, to remain aware of the raw power she still possessed. Slowly she accepted his offering, her movements deliberate and careful. As she ate, Ethan felt something stir within him, something subtle, like the first hint of spring after a long, brutal winter. He had long since stopped caring about anything or anyone, not since he withdrew into the wild. But as he watched her, a name came to him, as though it had always been hers. Amber. It felt right, simple, fitting. The brief encounter left Ethan with more questions than answers. By the time he returned to his cabin, the sun had risen higher, casting a golden light over the peaks. Yet, his mind was consumed with thoughts of Amber, the bear he had named, without knowing why. As the fire crackled in the hearth that evening, Ethan sat in silence, staring into the flames. The solitude he had once cherished now felt like a prison, one that separated him from something deeper. He thought of Amber, out there in the cold, and for the first time in years, an unfamiliar emotion stirred within him. He didn't know what it was, but it felt real. Without thinking, he packed extra provisions and gear, telling himself it was just precautionary. But a quiet anticipation filled him as he prepared to head out again the next morning. Something had changed within him, something he couldn't yet identify. The air was colder than before as Ethan retraced his steps from the previous day. The world was eerily still, the fresh snow glittering in the pale light of dawn. His boots crunched softly as he moved through the forest, following the faint trail Amber had left behind. He told himself he was only checking on her, but somewhere along the way, he realized that he had begun to care about this bear, a name, a purpose, things he had abandoned long ago. When the clearing came into view, his heart sank. Amber was not where he had left her, and a sense of panic rose within him. His eyes scanned the area until he found her, lying near the shadow of a fallen tree. She was curled up tightly, her massive form shivering from exhaustion. Her amber eyes, though dimmer, remained alert. She wasn't moving, but her gaze followed his every step. Slowly, cautiously, Ethan reached for the dried venison in his pack. "I brought you something," he said softly, barely more than a whisper. Amber didn't respond right away, but as the scent of the food reached her, her nostrils flared. After a moment of hesitation, she shifted, her head rising just enough to study him. "It's okay," Ethan murmured, his voice calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." Amber moved closer, her giant paws scraping the snow. The raw power of her movement reminded him of the danger she still posed, even in her weakened state. But Ethan felt no fear. The fragile trust between them was enough. She took the venison from his hand with surprising gentleness, her powerful jaws moving slowly to chew. Ethan watched her closely, his breath visible in the cold. For the first time in years, the weight of his past, the pain, the isolation, seemed to lift. He found himself speaking again, his words deliberate. "I know what you're thinking. Why would someone like me care about you? Truth is, I'm not sure. Maybe it's because you've been fighting as hard as I have." When Amber finished eating, she shifted slightly, her gaze softening. Ethan wondered if she truly understood him, or if the food was all that mattered. Either way, the bond between them had begun to take root. A gust of wind cut through the clearing, stinging Ethan's face. Amber flinched, her ears flattening. It was a subtle gesture, but it said everything. She was vulnerable, weakened by the fight for survival. Ethan's resolve hardened. He couldn't leave her like this. No matter the cost, he couldn't abandon her to face the brutal elements alone. "I'll be back," he promised softly, standing. Amber's eyes followed him, unafraid. She made no move to retreat, no signs of aggression. "Stay safe, girl." The journey back to the cabin felt heavier than usual. The cold bit into him, but his thoughts weren't on his own discomfort. They were on Amber. She needed more than food. She needed shelter. The hardest months of winter were still ahead, and he wouldn't leave her to face it alone. He realized then that the world he had fled from, the world of human connection, no longer mattered. Amber had given him a reason to fight once more. That night, Ethan sat by the fire, his weathered notebook open before him. The flames flickered, casting long shadows on the walls as he wrote, slowly and deliberately. "She's holding on," he wrote, "but just barely. The food helps, but it's not enough. She needs shelter, something more than a hollow in the snow." He paused, his pen hovering over the page for a long moment. His thoughts were heavy, and when he resumed writing, it felt almost like an afterthought. "She's tougher than she looks, and smarter too. There's something about her, something I can't quite explain." Closing the notebook, he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the low-burning fire. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of hope, not just for Amber, but for himself. The next morning, the sky was overcast, a pale mist clinging to the mountains. The forest held its breath. Ethan stepped out of the cabin, his pack over one shoulder, a bundle of supplies in hand. The cold in the air was sharper than usual, cutting through his thick coat and into his bones. He welcomed the discomfort. It helped clear his mind. The path to the clearing had become familiar, the tracks from his earlier visits guiding him. The wilderness around him stirred faintly, squirrels scurrying through the trees, a raven calling in the distance. But mostly, it was quiet. Ethan found peace in that silence, its honesty reminding him of the life he had left behind. When he reached the clearing, his breath caught. Amber was still there, but her condition had worsened. She seemed to sink deeper into the snow, her massive body almost blending with the landscape. She lifted her head at the sound of his approach, her amber eyes locking with his. They were dimmer than before, but there was something new in them, a glimmer of recognition. Ethan crouched at the edge of the clearing, setting his pack down gently. "Good morning, girl," he said softly, his voice breaking the stillness. He unwrapped the bundle, revealing a mix of smoked fish, dried meat, and roots he had gathered. "Got you something extra today?" Amber shifted, her movements slow but deliberate. She sniffed the air, her nostrils flaring as she caught the scent of the food. Ethan stayed still, watching as she edged closer. Her steps were measured, but there was a trust in them that hadn't been there before. She took the fish from his hand with the same gentleness, and Ethan smiled faintly. "You're a tough one," he murmured. "A real survivor." As she ate, Ethan's gaze drifted to her shelter, a hollow in the snow beneath a fallen tree. It was barely enough to protect her from the bitter winds. The thought of her enduring another storm there made his chest tighten. "You deserve better," he muttered. An idea began to form, risky and perhaps foolish, but it was clear. Amber needed more than food. She needed a proper shelter, something sturdy, something safe. That evening, after Amber had eaten, Ethan returned to the cabin. The sky darkened to a thick gray, hinting at an approaching storm. He didn't waste any time, gathering materials, fallen branches, dry moss, anything he could use to build a shelter. His hands worked quickly, and his mind raced with plans. By nightfall, he had a rough sketch in his notebook, crude, but enough to guide him. The next morning, snow began to fall heavily. Ethan worked through it, gathering more branches, tying them together with rope, layering the frame with moss and bark for insulation. The structure took shape, a low, sturdy hut nestled among the trees, hidden from view. It wasn't beautiful, but it would keep Amber safe from the worst of the storm. With the shelter complete, Ethan led Amber to it. She followed slowly, but there was a glimmer of trust in her movements. When she reached the structure, she paused, sniffing the air. Ethan stepped back, giving her space. She entered the shelter, and Ethan's heart lifted with relief. She was safe, for now. The storm raged throughout the night, and Ethan sat by the fire in his cabin, consumed with thoughts of Amber. Would the shelter hold? Would it be enough to protect her? He couldn't shake the worry gnawing at him, a worry he hadn't felt in years. But as the storm subsided and the sky began to clear, one truth was certain. Amber had become more than just part of the wilderness. She was a link to the world he had abandoned, and something had begun to grow between them. Thanks for watching.